Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this special episode, I'm taking another look at human risk through the lens of sport. In previous episodes, I've explored the idea of a hot hand. Do sports players really have streaks when they're proverbially on fire? I've also looked at the psychology of football, what some of you will call soccer, exploring questions such as how crowds and the absence of crowds under COVID influence games, and why it might counterintuitively actually make sense to pay players so much money. There are links to both of those episodes in the show notes. And it's football that I'm returning to this time. Even if you're not a sports fan, bear with me, because what you're about to hear are some fascinating human risk insights. My guest, Derek Rae, is a commentator who works for ESPN. In his career, he's covered a number of different leagues, but he's best known for his expert knowledge on my favourite league, the German Bundesliga. So while this episode is, of course, partly driven by my desire to spend time talking to someone who's helped me to get greater enjoyment from something I spend a lot of time watching, it's also an opportunity to learn some lessons about what drives human decision-making. Football is highly topical from a broader societal perspective, as it provides a focus for topics like racism and inequality. News of a recent failed attempt by certain Spanish, English and Italian clubs to form a European Super League is a good example of how football provides plenty of case studies for human risk. Although we recorded this episode before news of the league emerged, one of the reasons it failed is because German clubs like Bayern Munich and Dortmund refused to join. That's down to the fact that the ownership structure in German clubs is subject to regulations that give fans a much greater say in the way that clubs are run. In our discussion, we explore this and other dynamics of the sport, for which Derek is a passionate advocate. As someone who grew up in Scotland, his enthusiasm for the Bundesliga might come as a surprise, but it also gives him a very unique perspective and makes him ideally placed to explore the dynamics behind the sport he loves. As someone whose job involves understanding and influencing human decision-making, I also wanted to understand how Derek approaches his, which, at its simplest, involves watching and commenting on how other people are doing theirs. So please enjoy, and I know you will enjoy because Derek is incredibly engaging, my conversation with Derek Rae. Derek, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you for having me, Christian.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. It's so nice to speak to you because I've heard your voice and seen you on so many occasions. And to kickstart us off, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you, a Scotsman, came to be a passionate fan of the Bundesliga and living in America.
Well, that's a long story, so let's start at the beginning. It goes back to my days in Aberdeen. Now, if you think about the geography of Aberdeen, northeast of Scotland, right on the coast, and if you were to jump on a boat and travel in a certain direction, of course, you would come to Hamburg or the northern part of Germany. Now, in Aberdeen, as a young person, we used to get the radio signal from NDR radio from Hamburg straight into our homes in Aberdeen in the evenings. And that sort of coincided with my interest in German language, studying it at primary school from the age of, it would have been 9 or so on. I should say prior to that, the World Cup had happened in 1974 in West Germany. As it was, there's part of me that still thinks of West Germany and East Germany based on my childhood. And I was obsessed with that World Cup. I watched every game, but I became curious about the country of West Germany, also East Germany, because they were involved in the World Cup, and the language and the culture. So the two sort of went hand in hand. And as I was continuing my German studies, I realized that through NDR radio, North German radio, I could not only listen to news and music, but I could also listen to the Bundesliga Konferenzschaltung, to use the good German word, basically a back and forth between the various Bundesliga games with wonderfully evocative commentary. And so I would sit in my living room or bedroom in Aberdeen and lap all this up. So that's really when it started. And then as I began to study German in Germany, I would, of course, go to games. This would be taking us now to the mid-1980s. And it's really been part of me ever since.
Amazing stuff. We'll come on to your pronunciation piece because it's amazing to hear someone with a Scottish accent pronouncing things in German so well. And we'll talk about that. But I'm intrigued by the job that you do, which is, if I put it very simply, you watch other people doing their job and help people like me to understand what's going on. Which sort of sounds strange when you look at what drives the interest in that.
You know what? I've never really analysed that. So let's do it. Just you and I talking about it. I suppose that is the job. We are eavesdropping, if you like, on a conversation that is going on and is of interest to many people around the world, presumably at the highest level of football. And I think it takes a certain personality to be a football commentator. I think you have to be curious. You have to love football, first of all. But as a broadcaster, you have to be interested in other things, and you have to be interested in descriptive words. You have to be interested in word pictures. You have to be interested in trying to communicate and convey concepts and images to a wider public. Now, on TV, of course, we're not describing everything that we see because the viewer can see that for himself or herself. So we're really trying to come up with a memorable soundtrack that sometimes actually is saying nothing. Sometimes is actually just letting the picture and the image and the atmosphere speak for itself or for all aspects of the game in front of us. So I think that's, it's an interesting study in why we enjoy this. I can only say that it's something that appealed to me from a very young age. I used to impersonate commentators who I would hear on TV and radio in the 1970s. And I think that's how it started with a lot of fledgling commentators. We liked the sound of it and we wanted to try to replicate it. I mean, in my younger days in the 1970s, we were only just then getting to grips with the idea of listening to ourselves on tape. And that, again, was really how it started for me. My parents bought our very first stereo cassette recorder. And younger people always say to me, what on earth is a stereo cassette recorder? What would that look like? And trust me, at the time, Christian, it was a very revolutionary device. And I would spend hours just talking to myself into a microphone on this stereo cassette recorder. And then took a portable version of the same thing, which I bought out and about with me. And then you could listen to that back and take it from there. But, a few years prior to that, if you were to have tried to do that in the 1960s, for example, you probably couldn't have done that quite as easily because those recording devices simply didn't exist. So I think to sum it up, I think it's curiosity. I think it's words. I think we have to like and enjoy words and vocabulary. It's concepts. It's being a bit of a storyteller. I think that probably would sum it up best.
You recently posted your match preparation and a sort of picture, which I will put a link to that in the show. It's an astonishing. I mean, it's so the starting presumption is you would obviously use technology, and yours was beautifully handwritten, and clearly there's a method to that. How do you even start going about that? Because you clearly. There are predictable elements like the thing is going to last 90 minutes and somebody might score some goals and we have a rough idea who might play and obviously you know that just beforehand. But how do you even start to think about encapsulating all of the things that you might want to have covered for that?
Well, I think every commentator has his own or her own variation on that same theme. Now, the younger commentators tend to do it all using computers. I don't, and it's simply because in my younger days, this is how I did it. We didn't have computers. So what I do now is an extension of how I started. And how I started was broadcasting from very cramped stands with no elbow room. And if you think about it, you have to have all your notes on one efficient bit of A4 paper because you weren't able to bring 5 books and spread them out in front of you like I see younger commentators doing now. And so I was sort of a product of my time. But it also went hand in hand with my languages studies because I found that doing things like that in learning German really helped me, scribbling things on bits of paper in small books. I've actually still got some of those vocabulary books to this day behind me in my office here. And it was a simple case of color coding it. And on the left-hand side, the German word, on the right-hand side, the English word, and you'd fold over the bit of paper and you'd test yourself. Well, with my football commentary preparation, I'm sort of testing myself when I do it. So I start with a blank sheet of paper, and on the left-hand side will be one team, say it's Bayern, that would be in red. And then on the right-hand side, if it were, say, Schalke, that would be in blue. and it just helps reinforce what you're trying to memorize. And it's a bit like preparing for an exam and knowing that come exam day, you have to have it all, up here, all in your brain. And it's how you efficiently get to that point. So what I do is sort of day by day, if I know that I have a particular assignment 2 months ahead of time, I'll start scribbling. And, I won't do it all at once. It's a bit here, a bit there, an hour here, an hour there, over a period of time. And it's all getting ready for the exam paper that you're going to sit, or the exam that you're going to sit come match day. And usually I find that there's always a little bit of white on the paper until the last sort of hour or so before the game. And then I fill that in and I go, okay, that's all done. I've highlighted what I need to on this color-coded bit of paper. And to be honest, during a game itself, I probably look at that bit of paper no more than 4 or 5 times. And that usually is a sign to me that I've done my homework, that I didn't need to look at the paper. But I organize it in such a way that should I want to refresh my memory, usually at half time, I know exactly and intuitively on that bit of paper where it is, because I organize it in such a way that I have my players, the top half, and then sort of historical stuff midway down, and then after that form, and then tactical things, and then sort of last minute notes on players from a news point of view, things that have happened to them in maybe the days leading up to the game or stories that have emerged. So that's just my system. I would never pretend that it's the definitive system because, as I say, it's a matter of personal preference. And it's interesting, you won't really find 2 commentators who do it exactly the same way. You might find people of my generation do it more this way because it's what we grew up with. But it's always great fun to see what other commentators do and how they get their sheets prepared.
No, as I say, it looks masterful. So I will clearly the results great as well, which is helpful. So but I'll put a link to that in the show so people show. But I mean, one of the things that's obviously recently happened is you're not able, like the rest of us, not able to go to games. I guess if you were based in Germany, you would be able to. There are colleagues of yours that are able to do that. But you're currently sat at home.
Yes.
Watching this thing on television with the rest of us, I guess. How has that changed your perspective on things and how you do things and think about it? Is that to make it harder, easier?
Well, I suppose I've had a slight advantage because down the years, especially working with ESPN here in the USA, quite a lot of my work, even prior to the pandemic, has been, as we say, off-tube. Now, not all my work, but if you think about it, it wouldn't be efficient for every commentator to travel across the world to be at every game. And, even in Europe, a lot of commentators work off tube. And I always say that if we're doing a really good job, then the viewer at home shouldn't really know whether we're at the game or not. We shouldn't have to say we're here in the stadium or we're not here in the stadium. If it blends in properly, if we're doing our job, then we shouldn't have to make that point. So, it's frustrating, as the pandemic has been for everyone, but, we're all realists and we know that this is the new normal for the time being. And I, to be honest, sort of take the view that fans can't go to the stadium, so why should I be so privileged? And certainly it's just not practical because, as you've said, I live an ocean away from the action that I'm most intimately associated with. So, you do your homework, and luckily the way the games are covered nowadays, it's far easier to do a commentary off tube than it was even 20, 25 years ago. Back then, you were dealing with very grainy pictures, different technology, camera work and director work that wasn't as advanced as it is nowadays. And so, in many respects, and I actually often say this, there are times when I've done a game from the venue, and I've obviously been able to pick certain things out better than I would if I were off monitor. But there are actually times when it's more advantageous to call it off the monitor because you are looking at things that maybe you're not when you're inside the stadium. Now, when you're inside the stadium, you are kind of constantly moving your eyes back and forth. You're looking at the pitch, you're looking at your monitor, so you don't miss anything. But very often that one pitch perspective can open your eyes to something different. And it's it's a fascinating study. And
what's your perspective on the Geisterspiel, the games without spectators? How do you think that's evolved? And clearly, the standard answer, for understandable reasons, I miss going, is that it's not the same without the fans. But do you feel it's Have we got used to that now? Is that better than you expected?
It's better than I expected, yeah. I'll freely admit that before the pandemic, I had done a couple of Geisterspiele, to use the good German word, games without fans, literally ghost games, as you know. And I had not enjoyed the experience. And of course, these were sort of one-offs when a section of fandom had misbehaved and the punishment was to play in an empty stadium. And I've broadcast a couple of games like that before and found it very difficult because from a rhythm point of view as a commentator, we rely very heavily on the soundtrack, on the organic sound of the crowd, on the oohs and the ahs and anticipating when that's going to happen. And in Germany, the relentless noise that you get from the Kurve, from the area behind the goal. And to not have that means I think we've actually had to change our styles a little bit. And I'm a big believer that a commentator should say less rather than more. And I'm still a believer in that. But I think when you don't have the fans there, it does change how you pitch things a bit. Now, I think the one thing that I have learned a lot about during the pandemic and with these Geisterspiele is the extent to which coaches, some coaches more than others, can be pretty loud, and you hear certain coaches saying certain things. And if you speak German, obviously, as we do, it does sort of ram that home to you. And you think, okay, he's really going for it today, or he's always this way. And I wouldn't necessarily have known that before the pandemic. So you're always learning something. But yeah, I mean, to go back to your question, I miss the fans too, that they are, the living, breathing part of why we love football. And I think especially in a country like Germany, it's the country that has the highest attendance figures anywhere in the world on a week-to-week basis. And, we miss that. But of course, we understand why it can't be at the moment. And I think being adaptable is an important part of being a human being, that not everything stays the same. And we're in an emergency situation. And I think we're all just grateful that we've had some football to enjoy, albeit under different circumstances.
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, there's some weekends where it's just, what would I be doing if this wasn't?
Yeah.
And I got very frustrated with the international break. It was like, what's going on? What am I supposed to do?
You weren't alone. You weren't alone.
Yeah. and I mean, you talk about adaptability, and one of your sort of trademarks is the fact you go to a lot of effort to pronounce players' names correctly, by which I mean the way that they themselves pronounce them. And I find that absolutely fascinating. And there's I can contrast that starkly with certain other of your colleagues. I'm not going to ask you to comment on them unless you want to, who sort of don't really bother. And in some cases actually make up nicknames for the players themselves that have no bearing on anything we've ever heard before. And when I first heard that, I thought that just seems like a lot of effort. And then as I thought about it, I just thought actually it was fascinating from a respect perspective, because, people's names do matter. And I think it just struck me as a really relevant thing for particularly what's going on at the moment with diversity and inclusion. It strikes me as a really noble endeavor. And I'd love to sort of hear you talk a little bit around that, because I think clearly it requires effort.
Yeah, it does. I think you have to be committed to it. You have to be interested in the subject. And as I said earlier, I was always fascinated with languages, specifically German. And it really started when I began to hear, even on the BBC, and we tended to think the BBC was this gold standard that never got things wrong, but I would hear German names being mispronounced on the BBC, just sort of random German names, and I would think to myself, why is this happening? Aren't they supposed to get it right? And actually, when I joined the BBC as a young broadcaster, there was this entity called the Pronunciation Unit, and I learned about it on one of my BBC courses. And they said to me, or not just to me, but to everybody on the course, we are here for you. Our job is to provide you with the authentic, accurate pronunciation. And by the way, call us in the middle of the night, because that is our job. So I think I became known as the guy who would call the poor old pronunciation unit at 3 in the morning.
They didn't literally mean that.
They didn't literally mean it, but I was often doing the early sports shift. And I would quite routinely call this pronunciation unit. But so I think it started there, but it sort of grew with me as I moved to the USA and began to work for ESPN International and doing Brazilian football. I didn't speak I don't speak Portuguese fluently, but I thought, well, here's a new country to me. I want to get these names right because I know that the games are going around the world. There will be Brazilians watching these games. Who am I to go on the air and basically make up my own pronunciations? And in actual fact, I was greatly helped because we at ESPN had a Brazilian section, so that a group of Brazilian commentators who lived in the USA, but they'd be in the booth next to me. And so I'd always have a chat with them. They'd give me the news, things that were happening in Rio and Sao Paulo with regard to football and other things. And we'd always go over the names. And I remember one of them said to me, he said, it's really nice that you do this because, it's showing us respect and not everybody does that. So I think I had half thought about that, but hadn't gone the whole way with it. But as I began to work more and more with teams from various countries, I thought, well, again, in the USA, I mean, this is a melting pot of a country. Every country is represented here in one way or another. So that if I'm doing, Egypt, let's say, at a World Cup, there will be Egyptians watching my coverage of the game. I want to get their names right. I want the people from Egypt who are watching to say, that commentator, he's done his homework. They may not like other aspects of the commentary. That's fine. That's fair game. But I want them to say, yeah, that person knows what he's talking about when it comes to pronunciations. And it just seemed to me that, a lot of people didn't bother and don't bother. For some people, it's not that important. And there's a tendency in the Anglo world, I've found, to agree on a pronunciation, whether it's right or wrong. There's a kind of an idea that, well, as long as we're all saying the same thing, then that kind of becomes the person's name. And maybe I just haven't really been afraid to take a different view on that. And I always say, well, I can't control other people. If they want to say name X and pronounce it that way, that's their decision. But I can control what I do. I'm absolutely fully in control of what I do. And I want to set these standards for myself. And, there'll be times when I fall short too. There'll be times when I've had that wrong. But what I can say to you is that the commitment is always there. And it's important to me.
And it's incredibly noticeable. As you say, there's sort of the opposite extremities where people just don't make any effort. And the bit as I say, I found remarkable was that I sort of listened and thought, that's quite, he's really gone to town here, really. And you do, as you say, there are some names you pronounce differently to a host of. And I've seen people pile in on Twitter telling you that you're wrong.
Oh, yeah.
Which I find absolutely incredible, particularly given some of the lengths that you go to get this right. Because this isn't just sort of, I'll just go onto Google and hit the pronunciation. But, you speak to, I mean, is it true you speak to the consulates or the players themselves?
Well, the consulate thing I did, this was more sort of early in my career in the 90s. When we didn't have the same resources internet-wise, I realized living in the USA, the best way to get to a native speaker of a language was to call the embassy or the consulate. And I did that with quite a few countries. And I haven't done that as much recently, but I actually did it for when I was working back in the UK for BT Sport. I did it for a team from Belarus. Again, it's a language I don't have. And I have an idea about the phonetic sounds, but I wanted to talk to a native speaker, and I did. And I got those answers. So they're often very reliable because obviously they want to be accurate as well, because it's reflective of their country and their society. And the one that I get all the time is, a player who not all that long ago moved to Manchester United to play in the Premier League. And now I had said his name on the video game that I do, FIFA for EA Sports. I'd said his name a couple of years prior to that. And his name happens to be Bruno Fernandes. Bruno Fernandes. That's the Portuguese pronunciation of his name. And there's a clip actually of him saying his own name. It's a BT Sport clip, which you can find freely online. But for some reason, when he arrived in England, nobody wanted to go down that road, or maybe nobody knew. People just looked at the name and thought, I read it as Bruno Fernandes, and that's what I'm going to say. So he's kind of stuck with that name in England. But, I can assure you, it's not his name. It's not what he says. It's not what his family says. And I'm kind of the lone wolf who, and again, when you do a video game, you can't change the name every week. Not that I would, because I don't really see value in changing a name to something that is not someone's name.
Right. And as you say, it does stand out. But it really, I was thinking in terms of sort of, it's a very colonial attitude.
Yep.
And I was sort of thinking back to teachers that might say, well, I can't pronounce your name, so I'm going to call you X.
Yeah.
Or we see in Asia, people adopt Western sounding names, and fine if it's their genuine choice. But I think it's a fascinating sort of piece of our time. And it's really, if nothing else, take it from me, you've made me really think about that and put more effort into the way I do things. And I think I was incredibly lazy on that front. So thank you for making me a better person and more engaging.
No, I'm sure I wasn't a big influence at all, Christian. But it's nice to hear that. And I think that respect is at the forefront of all of this. And when you turn it around, especially to somebody from the UK, and you say to them, okay, tell me your surname. And for example, the name Jones, right? If that name were to be said in Spain, that might be pronounced Jones or something like that. Now, if somebody kept calling you Senor Jones, after a while, you might say, actually, it's Jones. My name is Jones. And that's respect that somebody gets your name right in return. But people seem to have trouble kind of seeing it from that point of view. And I've even had discussions with people who seem to be of the belief that there is such a thing as a British pronunciation of somebody else's name. And I said, well, no, that's you making up a pronunciation of somebody else's name. There is, just as there is no Spanish pronunciation of Jones, there is no British pronunciation of a Spanish person's name or a Portuguese person's name. There's just a wrong pronunciation of that name. And speaking of sort of German words, one of the things that your commentary is very rich on is not just what's going on the pitch, but some of the traditions around it. And you did a lovely thing last year called Backyard Bundesliga, where you stood in your backyard, would wear a relevant shirt, and give us a kind of Twitter, a few minutes worth of what to look out for the weekend. And I loved it, by the way. So if you have the time, please do it again. But I'm fascinated by your interest in traditions. And I think of, if we take FC Köln to Cologne for English speakers, there's a whole carnival tradition there that you're clearly wrapped up in. We can talk about goats as well. We can, definitely. But you grab part of that as well and bring that in. So we're not, if I listen to a Derek Rae commentary, it's not just, here's what's going on the pitch. You get a sense of the local culture. And that seems to be it's an integral part of the sport, but it's very much an integral part of your commentary as well. Yeah, thank you for noticing that. It's something that I think struck me when I first went to Germany, was that every club had a story. And especially the Traditionsvereine, to use the German word, clubs with a tradition, and Köln certainly fall in that category. Teams like Stuttgart as well, Borussia Dortmund, Borussia Mönchengladbach, go down the list. And as I got older and did a bit of broadcasting, starting with the BBC, it struck me that in the UK, where I was working, obviously, there was a tendency to kind of make it sound as though the UK was the only country that had traditions. The FA Cup, we love the FA Cup. It's magical. Nobody does anything like, listen, I love the FA Cup too. It's a great competition. But there is the DFB Pokal that also has its own traditions in Germany. And I would argue nowadays is actually a more relevant, better cup competition than the FA Cup. But it has stories too, just as every country has its own story. So I wanted to do something like that during the initial part of the pandemic, because it was clear that the Bundesliga was coming back before virtually every other major league. And people were suddenly desperate to watch the Bundesliga. And I saw this on my social media feeds, that people who normally might watch Liverpool or Manchester United suddenly, we're going to watch the Bundesliga this week because football is back and it's the Bundesliga. So I thought, here's a good chance to go online and share a bit of knowledge and talk about the stories of German football that don't get talked up enough, in my opinion. And I think it's the one thing that maybe is missing a little bit from the overall narrative with regard to the Bundesliga. People might know about the modern Bundesliga, they might know about modern players, they might know about how good Bayern were last season or even, in recent years, but do they know the great stories of the early Bundesliga years in the 1960s when the league came into being? Do they know some of the stories of the great Bayern teams of the 1970s, featuring the likes of Müller, Beckenbauer and Hoeneß? Do they know about Borussia Mönchengladbach from that slightly later 1970s period when they were arguably the best team in Europe, and so on and so on and so on. And as you said, also Köln, I have a soft spot for them. And they have a billy goat for a mascot. They have the most famous anthem in German football, loved by everybody, whether you're a fan of Köln or not. They have the cathedral in the city, which is part of the identity. All these sort of things put together and wrapped into one package. And I just thought it was a chance to break new ground. And it does seem that struck a chord with quite a few people.
Yeah, and because I think it is fascinating when you look at football as a commoditized product. On the one hand, you could say, well, actually, people that don't get it would just sort of say, well, it's football, it's the same thing. Yeah. And but there is a fundamental difference, and I think if you don't understand some of these things, you are not that you can't watch the game, but you're missing something there, and you haven't got a full perspective on what's going on, and I think that adds something to the television spectator. And actually, even if you're on the ground, it's helpful to have somebody pointing these things out to you, because once you've seen them, firstly, you can't unsee them, which is never a bad thing. But secondly, I think it really does increase the enjoyment, because you suddenly go, oh, I now understand the broader context of what's going on.
Yeah, spot on. And I think that, to use an example of, and I spoke about, the traditions in the UK, when NBC came on air in the USA with their coverage of the Premier League a few years ago, they do a wonderful job. And they did a great job, I feel, of explaining to new fans, why some of these venues in England are special and incorporating the history. And, I have a lot of these stories in my head with regard to Germany, but there hasn't really been an outlet for them, because that hasn't been what has been sold so much. And I'm not saying that is what would attract everybody, but it is a huge part of it. German football, my goodness, what a story when you think about the success that the country has had at national team level, when you think about the great club sides, it's all there. And you have new clubs that have emerged. You have your Hoffenheims and your Wolfsburgs and your Leipzigs, new in terms of, relatively speaking, having had success. But you have these tradition-rich clubs as well, Schalke, Köln, Stuttgart, Hamburg. And, they all have important stories to tell as well. So, I make a point of that. And I do make a point of just refreshing my memory before every game with regard to the history and being able to make reference to an important piece of history. And to be honest, you never quite know when, if you're doing a Gladbach game, for argument's sake, there's a chance if he's at the game, you're going to get a close-up of Berti Vogts, one of the all-time Gladbach greats. And it helps to be prepared for that. Rainer Bonhoff, another one who, from that era. And so it's all part of it. And the history, I think, is sometimes an underrated aspect of storytelling.
And then the other bit that fascinates me is having said that you don't just talk about what goes on the pitch, you talk about the history. The other bit that you're intimately involved in is the sort of psychodrama. I don't mean personally involved, but you're sort of observing all of whether it's managers and they're going to stick around, players, and more recently, I guess, in COVID, you've also done a line in sort of COVID commentary, which I think is relevant to all of these other considerations. So it forces you to take you decide quite rightly, I think, in my opinion, to take a broader societal view. How do you think about that? Because now, if I start from the premise of you're watching some people doing their job, suddenly you're watching much more. You're observing other aspects of their lives. And, because players, particularly at the moment, but generally players' personal lives do feed into the decision-making, and what happens off the pitch has a huge influence of going on the pitch. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I thought about it a lot more during this pandemic. And you're right. I have tweeted probably more about the pandemic than your average commentator would. He might or she might stick to football and not sort of move into that sphere. But I just think it's something that is affecting all of us. And I thought, well, I'm in a position here. And actually, it was at the start of the pandemic, I realized that just because of a lot of the feeds that I follow and speaking German, I had access to a lot of information about what other countries were doing in terms of the pandemic and sport. And, if you think back to March of 2020, all of a sudden, there was that, sort of fateful week when everything seemed to close down. Every league suddenly said, right, we're closing down, or we're probably going to close down. Now we are closed down until further notice. And I read the German news every day. I listen to it. I watch it. So there's often things that I hear there that I pass along that, might be interesting to somebody who's not following the German news every day of the week. I think that the other thing too, Christian, is that, to me, and again, this goes back to my younger days following German football especially, but also I think as a Scot, because I think in Scotland it's maybe slightly different than it is in England. Football is part of society. Football is very much an extension of everyday society for the average person. It's never had in these countries a sort of a prawn sandwich element, to use Roy Keane's turn of phrase, which I thought was quite good at the time. I thought it was quite apt. But and I'm not saying in England it really is necessarily vastly different, but I think there is a different aspect to society in England. I think there is more of a private school tradition. I think that people look at these things in a slightly different way. And so I've always sort of thought that, if we are all part of the same society, then we're all living through a pandemic and it's affecting the sport that we love, then the two are kind of interconnected. And for me to just simply say, well, I'm never going to tweet about what's happening with the pandemic, I'm never going to tweet about COVID because that is kind of getting into a different territory, then I, would be maybe doing it wrong just in terms of reflecting my own personality.
And, one of the sort of aspects of it, and particularly with the club that I support, Bayern, is at the particular moment, there is a heck of a lot of drama around individuals. And of course, other clubs have their own derivatives of it. And there are large swathes of German journalism that are dependent on there has to be some element of drama and intrigue. Otherwise, they can't report anything. And some of them report with greater accuracy than others, should we say. And how far do you get into that? Because, you strike me as not being someone that would just chase tittle-tattle and celebrity gossip for the hell of it. And yet, on the other hand, it's of interest and relevant. I want to know who the manager of my club is going to be next season. I want to know the players they're going to buy. I'm kind of intrigued. Why has he decided to play this player? Is there some politics attached to this, or is it genuine? So it's of interest to people at a legitimate level, but at some point it becomes sort of gossipy. How do you draw the line between those two things in terms of your interest in it?
Yeah, with difficulty is the honest answer. I think Bayern are sort of the exceptions, because to me, Bayern is this strange fusion of celebrity culture, politics, definitely politics when it comes to how the club is operated, success at a very high level, high-profile players, this sort of coming together of all these features. And the fact is, you can't get away from Bayern. You pick up any German newspaper, you watch any German sports program, Bayern will feature, whether it's been a busy week or a quiet week. And we happen to be talking at the moment in a very busy spell with regard to the future of the coach, Hansi Flick, and specifically a bit of a row between him and Hasan Salihamidzic, the sporting director. And that is going to be covered every day, I think, until there is a resolution here, until we know exactly who's going to be around next season, how this will be resolved. But I think it's, in many respects, typical Bayern. I think back to when Niko Kovac was in charge and seemed to be on borrowed time almost from day one. That was the sort of the narrative. Was he going to fit Bayern? Was he going to be the right guy? Was he good enough for Bayern? All these things. And eventually, it was deemed that he wasn't the right guy there. So I think Bayern are the exceptions. I do agree that sometimes I think we can go overboard with speculating. What I tend to try to do when I reflect on it is I will report what I consider to be good sources are saying, because obviously I'm not living and breathing Bayern at the Zebener Strasse headquarters every day, much as I would quite enjoy doing that, I think. But I'm not. So I'm far away from it. But I'm also hearing probably more quickly what's happening just through contacts, and also being able to watch and read a lot of it. So I do find it fascinating. I think that, I'm not a Bayern fan per se. I'm a commentator, but I do find the whole subject matter of Bayern something that, is pretty irresistible.
It's highly. I find myself watching press conferences. Yeah. It was a lovely time, actually. I was a very familiar voice came in in German in the middle of all the tittle-tattle, and you actually asked about something quite relevant. I was quite shocked, but it was nice to hear you breaking into that sort of celebrity journalism that was there. And that's one end of the spectrum. But clearly there's a sort of economic and social impact of that the sport has in Germany at the moment. And I wonder what your thoughts were on commercialization of the game. There's a lot of noise around these sort of, I have to be very careful being a Bayern fan what I say, but sort of Arabist clubs that have interesting sponsors. What are your thoughts on the sort of the economics and how things are evolving?
I think that German football is at a bit of a crossroads on that front, because clearly you have clubs who have started to prosper with slightly different models. And to go back to Traditionsvereine that we spoke about earlier, clubs who are these traditional powers who are maybe sort of falling on harder times. It's difficult. It's difficult for a Köln or a Schalke. When you look at how Leipzig are doing it, you look even from the point of view of Köln, you look up the road at Leverkusen and what they're doing with a model that might be leaner and meaner, but it's not an accepted model compared to the way Köln do it, in German terms anyway. And I think it's something German football is wrestling with. I would say that most German fans, the ones I speak to, they don't want the Bundesliga to become the Premier League. They might respect the Premier League, they might watch the Premier League, but they don't want to turn it into the Premier League. They're very happy with the model of more than 100,000 members at any particular club and having these voting rights and things being kept affordable and also community-based. Because even a club like Bayern, they might be this big world power, but there's still an element of community about who and what they are. Mia San Mia, we are who we are. They don't want to morph into Manchester City or Manchester United. They want to be Bayern and they want to be true to those Bavarian roots. But I think it is getting ever more difficult. And I think that, clubs are finding a way around those traditional models. Leipzig are a very good example. And, I don't love the Leipzig model. I respect greatly what they do from the football operation point of view. I think they have very good people in charge there and have had for a good number of years. But, the club that I follow, I'm not sure I necessarily would be attracted to a model like that, to a construct like that. But I think it's something that is probably going to move more in that direction. And it's a question of how the Bundesliga can keep its traditional face while at the same time incorporating these new structures.
And of course, one of the issues is costs and particularly players. And that we've had sort of astronomical numbers, and the numbers seem to keep going up. And my gut reaction was always, well, this is ridiculous. And I'd had Rafa Honigstein on last year, and he said, well, I actually think there is a justification for the sorts of numbers that are there because they are able to draw an audience at a particular point in time. In an on-demand world, having something that people will religiously watch at a particular time is worth something from a broadcasting perspective, let alone marketing and everything else. Is that a view you share, that the sums we're talking about are sort of astronomical by anyone's estimates, and yet there is a sort of economic rationale to it? And if that's true, then how does a league that is not necessarily best positioned for that cope? Yeah,
I mean, that is the big dilemma. Rafa obviously knows, what he's talking about when it comes to this sort of thing. And, I think that the Bundesliga, the one thing that maybe doesn't get mentioned enough is the sustainability part of it. I think, and I talk a lot to people in Scotland and specifically fans of Celtic, who always want to learn from the German model. How is it they do it? How is it their scouting is so good? And I will say, well, it's kind of a joined-up plan, and this is how you increase value for the league and specifically for the individual clubs. I look at a club like Borussia Mönchengladbach, who I happen to think are really the model for how almost every sort of mid-sized club, mid to upper-sized club around Europe should do it, and that is with a properly joined-up plan with maybe, I don't think it's stretching it too far to say, maybe the best sporting director in all of German football in Max Eberl. And I know Bayern at one time reached out to see whether they could get him. I mean, he's good. He's been doing it for a long time, and he understands what he's doing. And so it starts with the scouting. It starts with knowing how you get players, promising players, how you polish them, and eventually sell them on. And again, to somebody outside Germany, that almost sounds like a sort of a defeatist attitude. Oh, you're going to polish these young players, and then you're just going to let them go. I mean, what's the point of that? Well, there is sustainability in doing that, and you are building something, and then you go and rinse and repeat and do the same thing and the same thing over and over and over again. And, the value is there. I mean, people are watching the Bundesliga more and more. I'm always heartened when I hear more countries are tuning into the Bundesliga. I think we have to say, though, that it did fall behind early on in comparison with the Premier League. The Premier League was very quick off the mark in realizing how international penetration could be achieved and, jumped way ahead of all comers in that regard. But I think the Bundesliga is fighting back in its own way. And this is why, to go back to the earlier answer, I think it is this fusion of, dynamic football, young players, good coaching, great tactics, but the history as well and the stories and sort of, putting a human face on all of this. And once somebody discovers that and figures all that out, and I will say once they have the Bundesliga as part of them, then it's part of them forever.
And I think it is interesting when you depict it in those terms, because the lens that says not successful, and there is this nonsense about Farmers League. It's the classic sort of criticism.
Where did that come from?
Which I'm not quite sure why that's supposed to be an insult either, because I wouldn't be messing around with many of the farmers.
True.
It seems like quite insulting. But it's interesting because it does. I think it's a very 21st century challenge around what are if we look at what are companies there to do.
Yeah.
There's the same sort of question here, which is football all around? Can you make the maximum amount of money, or is it about something a little bit more? And in common with the Germanic approach to business, there is a lot more of a sort of social element there, and there's a social purpose to it. And so these commercial pressures, which seems to be the benchmark that people are using, saying, well, you're failing, you haven't got as much turnover. Actually, that leads to some other interesting outcomes. And it strikes me that what is a good example, I think some of the regulation that are there and helping to preserve some of these things. And therefore, if you look at it through the wrong lens, you'll get the wrong answer. But if you start to understand why, it is a very different perspective on what clubs are there to do and how they are run.
Yeah, and if you think about German culture, and one of the things that impressed me when I first went to Germany as a young person was that every local area had its own sports club, and the sports club incorporated football, handball, volleyball, athletics, you name it. It was a sports club for the community. It wasn't there to make money. It was there to kind of provide a service. And I think there's always been this kind of social balance in Germany. To go back to the 1950s and the 60s, the mixed economy in Germany. Germany was talking about a mixed economy before that was fashionable really anywhere else in Europe. So yes, you had business, but it had to coexist at the same time with, social considerations, society as a whole. It couldn't just be about making money and, to heck with everything else. And I think that, seeped into German football because it is inextricably part of German society. And maybe that's something that in other countries, and again, England is the best example of it, maybe a country where that is no longer the case at the highest level. Germany is just different. And it strikes me that this is why a lot of UK fans, back when pre-pandemic it was possible to do this, a lot of UK fans really latched on to going to Germany for the weekend. Now, I never got to do that as a young guy because it just wasn't as easy to jump on a plane and go to a game in Germany. Probably could have done, but it was, I think, more expensive back in those days, but it just became something that was available. And I look at, in particular, Union in Berlin, in Köpenick. They're now a Bundesliga club. They have been since 2019. But even prior to that, you had these people from the UK who would go there every weekend, jump on a cheap flight to Berlin, go and watch the game, go home again afterwards. But this became part of their ritual. And what they liked was that it was basic love of football. It wasn't about the commercialism. It wasn't about anything like that. It was about simply going to watch the team that they had come to love and standing, because there aren't many seats at the Stadion an der Alten Försterei in Köpenick. So, all these things were an attraction. And I see that when I go to, as I often do, to games in Köln, at the Rhein-Energiestadion. And there you will hear British accents, you'll hear Irish accents, and they're attracted by this kind of community without the overt commercialization. Certainly, I mean, it's there. Of course it's there. It has to be. It is a business. But it doesn't strike you that it's in your face the way it is with the Premier League now.
And you can watch the game and drink a beer, which to my mind puts it streets ahead of the Premier League.
Yep. So, it's not a bad deal, that. Yeah.
It's absolutely fabulous. And, as you sort of look ahead, there are lots of changes being proposed to things like the Champions League and, other sort of limitations coming in. And people, the governments are paying attention to sport possibly in a way they haven't done before for all sorts of reasons. How do you see the future being able to preserve that model? I mean, do you think it's capable of sustaining? Is change required?
I think we have to fight for it. I think those of us who believe in it, I think that, as I said earlier, there will be changes. And, Bayern, for example, they are sort of a hybrid model, if you like, in terms of how they are run. They're not 100% 50+1. They have membership and everything, but part of the operation is not done that way. And that's true, actually, of many of the Bundesliga clubs. But it's a big debate with Schalke at the moment. The pro department there. What happens with 50+1 going forward? Clubs are looking for different ways to raise revenues. And, I've also heard it said that it does make it leaner and meaner from a decision-making point of view if you are not restricted by having to, have these hundreds of thousands of members give the go-ahead to everything. I just hope that German football keeps this part of its character because, as you rightly remarked earlier, I am a fan of tradition, not for the sake of tradition, but when I think the tradition is a good tradition and I think is something that reflects well on society as a whole. And I think this tradition in German football differentiates it from football in most other countries, and it's a big plus. And I really would be disappointed to see that thrown away, even if it were to mean that by throwing it away, you could someday make the Bundesliga what the Premier League is now in terms of international interest and awareness and penetration. I don't think I would want that. I like my Bundesliga because, again, it reminds me of first going to Germany as a wide-eyed student and just thinking, this is amazing. I love all of this. I love all the aspects of this. I love the beer. I love the bratwurst. I love the banter. I love the fact that it doesn't seem so corporate. It seems more linked to the average fan.
And I think their slogan, football the way it's meant to be.
Yeah, it's a good one, isn't it?
Hits the nail on the head. It is. Yeah. And I think to your point, is many of the people going to watch it, there is an element of time travel if you're coming from the UK.
Yeah.
In a really positive sense, not in a sort of primitive sense.
Yeah. Yeah, you're going back to childhood memories. You're going back to a time when it wasn't as corporate. Final
question for me is have you ever thought about going into the game? It's your view is either as a player, I guess, if you had the ability, or even sort of in management thing. Because one of the sort of challenges, I guess, to commentators, well, if you know so much about it, why don't you do it? Now, I don't think you're not the sort of person who's sitting there going, I'd have played these players. Yeah, so I accept that's not a valid criticism. But have you ever thought about taking the knowledge you've got and doing something within the game?
Oh, that's a really good question. Not so much. I mean, I love what I do. I love commentating. I love being at games. I love talking to football people. But I didn't play the game at a high level. I realized early on that talking about it gave me a better future than playing it. I would never claim to know more than somebody like Hansi Flick about tactics or anything like that. I mean, the one thing that in the last year, this sort of came out of the blue, but Berwick Rangers, who I think have a great story, and this is why they were of interest to me. Berwick Rangers, an English club, technically in England, but actually who've always played in Scotland, and responsible for the biggest upset in the history of the Scottish Cup when they beat Rangers back in 1967. They said to me, we'd love to have you, if you're interested, just as a voluntary position, be our international ambassador. And I thought, well, I would love that. Yeah, I'd love that because I think you have a story to tell, and I'd love to help you tell that story. And, it's a small commitment. But it sort of did get me thinking that, in years ahead, some involvement with a team, not obviously as a sporting director or as a coach, but if I have any kind of knowledge picked up through the years that might help, whether it's, as an associate director or something, if somebody thought that I had qualifications for that, then, I'd probably be interested in that. But I think we're maybe a few years away from it.
No, because I'd love to see you being remunerated by the Bundesliga properly for promoting the league, because I think you tell the story, and the story's there to be told, but there is something incredibly engaging about the way you tell it, and this does require passion, because this is not a rational sale. If I think about, I'm sitting in front of the television on a Saturday afternoon, entirely illogical. It can be beautiful sunshine outside, and I must watch this game, and I will even watch games I'm not that interested in because something might happen. Yeah.
No, well, listen, it's a labor of love for me, as I think it is for you. I think, you're the same. You love your German football. And some things, when you have that passion, and somebody told me this at a very young age, said, always try to find a line of work that you're passionate about, because then it won't always seem like work. And that is the honest truth. When I'm broadcasting the Bundesliga, it's my job, and I'm 100% professional, and I want to get it right, but it's also my passion. And if you can combine those two things, then you're laughing. Really, you're going into every day going, oh great, I'm doing Wolfsburg against Stuttgart today. Brilliant, can't wait. Whereas if you're not passionate about a particular league, it might seem more like a job, and that happens to every commentator, to anybody else working in the media. But I've been incredibly lucky, because I had to wait quite a long time in my career to have this more intimate association with the Bundesliga. I'd always followed it. I'd always watched it and listened to it. It had been part of my life, but professionally much more so in the last decade. And very thankful for that.
Amazing stuff. Well, listen, firstly, thank you so much for making something that I enjoy even more enjoyable than it is anyway, and really adding, literal colour to the picture, which I think is an incredible talent you have. So thank you for doing it. And thank you also for coming on the podcast and being an absolutely fascinating guest. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine, Christian. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it a lot.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Derek for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about the topics that we discussed on the show, have a look in the show notes. There are links to a number of those, including some of the social media activity that Derek and I discussed, including his back garden Bundesliga videos. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you're interested in finding out more about human risk, visit human-risk.com for further resources, including the Human Risk newsletter, video channel, and other information about the work that I do with my clients to help them mitigate their human risk. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.